Thank you. Thank you, Kai. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to André to have invited me to this marvelous conference. Formulated as an alternative, the question of ideology or personal gain seems relatively simple to deal with if we have a look to the people who formed the platoons of policemen, shooters, and even to the NCOs of the groups. The regional and local offices of the Gestapo, the Kripo, and the security service were ordered to command precise numbers of civil servants or agents without any operative or functional selection. None of the people of the crews had been selected for a real or supposed ideological radicality or for any disposition or appetence to kill. The making of the Einsatzgruppen plan for Barbarossa, for the invasion of USSR, was a result of a classical, bureaucratical, legal, rational process of recruitment that had, in the first sight, almost nothing to do with fanatism, hatred, or economical interests. But one would argue that personal gain is not, one would argue that personal gain is not necessarily economical. And here can the question become a bit more interesting, because the reflection on the perpetration's experience of the genocide starts here, at this point. To get into this question, what the most interesting and simplest way is a biographical approach. That's the reason why I choose to introduce the case studies, even if he is not involved in the mass killings that took place in Babi Yar. Alfred Filbert, to whom Alex Kay dedicated an excellent PhD thesis, belongs to the leadership of the units that carried out the genocide in occupied Soviet Union. He was active during the first month of the invasion, but his trajectory seems to help us to raise two questions to study this alternative between ideology and personal gain. We will therefore study Filbert's biography before 1941 and his recruitment in his killing unit, then explore the content of personal gain through his example, and then we'll try to shed a light on the experience of those SS leaders, made in the so-called Osteinsatz, the action in the East. Alfred Filbert is born in May 1905 in a middle-class family. His father is a middle-ranked civil servant in the post and served during the First World War. His childhood and teenage time have been coined by the war and the French occupation of Rhineland. His family seems to be a right-wing, traditional, nationalist-oriented, but we don't have the clues of any commitment of his relatives before the Nazi seizure of power. Alfred Filbert studies in Gießen and Heidelberg, and is active in the Völkische movement, the ethno-nationalistic movements, and prior to join the NSDAP in 1932. As a Rhinelander, as a person from the Rhineland, he belongs to young students in law recruited by Werner Best in the security apparatus during his legal clerkship as trainee. In the meantime, he had become a volunteer in the security service of the SS. Filbert is the perfect example of what is called the Kriegsjugendgeneration, the generation of war youth, well described by historians Ulrich Herbert and Michael Wild. Coined by his war experience and the post-war delinquencies of the young Weimarer Republic, he combines in his profile academic excellence with political radicality and desire to replace democracy by what he thinks to be a global political system that could lead to Germany's regeneration. In March 1935, he's enlisted in the SD, no longer as a volunteer, but as an appointed SS officer with the rank of an SS Untersturmführer lieutenant, then captain in 1937. He finally becomes head of the intelligence service abroad and acts like the deputy of the head of the service. That is precisely the reason why he is the one who received the warning of Heydrich, telling him the absolute necessity to raise the level of information of the intelligence service abroad. The problem was twofold. First, the reports were being made of abstract of foreign newspaper and radio broadcast. Second, the Department 6 had been unable to organize the German diaspora in Eastern Europe in an accurate intelligence network. The failure to work with other SS agencies was a main problem here. As a result, the Department 6 was in the line of fire of Heydrich in the reorganization of the intelligence service within the Race Security Main Office. Heydrich was planning, along with Walter Schellenberg. During the period of foundation of this Race Security Main Office in 1939 and 1940, the reorganization of the police and the security service, Philbert was merely the only Department 6 staff member to take part to the leaders' meeting under Heydrich's supervision. In the same time, however, Philbert encounters troubles in his private life. His brother was held in a concentration camp after public criticism to Hitler. Such an incident took place in a family that was obviously committed to National Socialism, as shows the numerous membership to NS Care organization and the refusal of Philbert's father to fund his son's defense costs. Whether these private problems or the growing crisis in the Race Security Main Office Department 6 were the causes of Philbert's stagnations remains unclear. Fact is that Philbert started instruction periods in the Waffen-SS at the summer 1940. Like a rather large group of Gestapo and SD leaders, and he explained after the war before the court that he had joined the Waffen-SS because of the troubles he experienced in his duties. So did he, with the Einsatzgruppen gathered for the invasion of USSR in April '41. Did he enlist with the hope to boost his career, or did he instead try to commit himself in a more martial way for the Tausendjähriges Reich? His behavior and self-perception is coined by a martial ethos, by a heroic realism, to quote the founder of the Race Security Main Office, Werner Best. But does that exclude necessarily every personal strategy, every ambition, every quest of personal gain? The answer seems thus to combine both motivation, rather to exclude one of them. In his post-war testimonies and interrogations, Philbert always mentioned himself as a soldier serving as Einsatzkommando leader. Beyond every exculpation strategy that disguised the genocide as a war against the Jews. This kind of rhetoric seems to have a central meaning in his self-construction. In his argumentation, Philbert is no murderer, but a soldier, and in 1941, when he enlisted, a Kriegsfreiwilliger, a war voluntary, a hero. He thinks he is a hero, and even after the war, he still keep on thinking that. In Philbert's case, then, the first personal gain is self-esteem. He was not only the only one in this case. The rhetoric of the Osteinsatz, the service in the East, was powerful enough among SS militants, not the population and the SS hierarchy knew it perfectly, but to push hundreds of young activists to commit themselves in the Germanization policies in the East. But let's take seriously a moment the material side of personal gain. Did Philbert have gained anything when he came back from the East? Neither in his career nor in his assets. He had indeed been the leader of one of the most advanced groups in the elite organization of the Third Reich. He had therefore, and Edward Westermann say it perfectly, experienced a feeling of racial superiority and power during the first week of occupation, but it didn't have any impact on his material life as he came back in Germany in October 1941. The irony of the situation is that Philbert was precisely accused of corruption and misappropriation of funds of the Race Security Main Office as he came back from Osteinsatz. Shame, instead of a cheering welcome back home for the Nazi hero. The accusation was twofold. First, Philbert was accused to have retained a large sum of money in foreign currency for his own use, and second, to have taken a dubious loan for the purchase of a house in Berlin-Wannsee. In the case of Philbert, Service in the East has nothing to do with real or imaginary corruption. He was accused of corruption, but in his duty as an SS officer in Berlin. It is uneasy to conclude upon the reality of the charges against Philbert. Fact is that these charges were the pretext chosen to fire him and his chief, Heinz Jost, and to replace them with Heydrich's favorite expert, Walter Schellenberg, at the head of Department 6. Fact is also that Philbert did not receive any affectation during the 2 following years, but no sanction was taken against him. Philbert just spent the next 2 years home, and thus, in the one in Wannsee he had tried to purchase with the loan in question, and that he purchased for good in 1943. Finally, Philbert was assigned to the Race Security Main Office again in the criminal police, in an office specialized in the economic crimes and the struggle against corruption in the SS administrations. The SS hierarchy had a growing conscience, leaderships had a growing conscience that the leaders of some institutions like concentration camps or economic and administration offices were exposed to the temptation of an easy money coming from the predation of the Jewish victim of the genocide and the trade of the enslaved inmates of the concentration camps with the German war industry. In this perspective, Philbert was the ideal candidate. He had first-hand experience of the accusation of corruption, and as a former commando leader, he knew the principles of the organization of mobile inquiry commissions that would carry out the repression against this kind of crimes. But much more important, and in contradiction with all this post-war declaration, this new assignment showed without any ambiguity that he was considered as a reliable SS Führer, whose neither ideological conviction nor material behavior could be put in question. Despite the career troubles, despite the firing, despite the rather short Osteinsatz experience, Philbert had made his proof in 1944. Let's get back finally to his service in the East, his service in the East to conclude this reflection on the respective parts of ideology and personal gain in the motivations in the service of the East of the SS leaders. When the Einsatzgruppen leadership was built in the month preceding the invasion, Philbert was among the officers who volunteered. Even though he pretended after the war, having been ignorant of the murderous tasks that the groups would carry out, he belonged to the best-informed SS leaders on the various stages the so-called final solution of the Jewish question had taken between 1939 and 1941. He did volunteer also at the time as it became clear that the campaign in USSR was backed by a hunger plan, a so-called plan of starvation, in which the population of the main cities of USSR were dedicated to death by starvation, so that the Jewish population of USSR, largely concentrated in the cities of the residence area since the Tsarist Empire, was globally dedicated to death, even indirectly. His strategy of defense, in his interrogations as convicted, in his trial, as well as in testimonies while serving his penalty in prison, or during interviews, for instance, with the psychologist Henry Dix, relied upon the assertion that he had received an order of indistinct killing of the Jews before the 22nd of June, 1941, which has been proven to be false. But he must have been aware that the so-called executive measure he would have to implement during his service as commando leader represented a huge murderous task. As already said, neither during the war nor during his post-war life, he never conceived his Osteinsatz as a crime, but as a war assignment, a duty that transformed the genocide into a war against the Jews, in which he received orders, in which it committed itself as a soldier and later as a pawn victim of the humanity of his superior, without the possibility to avoid obedience. That was his strategy of defense. Nonetheless, even within this late rhetoric, Philbert remained convicted that he had been a soldier thrown in a racial war, which is precisely the core of the ideology or propaganda widespread by the NS leadership among the army and the SS formation. Even when he tried to avoid culpability, even when he made efforts to appear as a victim or an obedient civil servant, his discourse stayed drenched in the National Socialist phraseology, racism accepted. During his month as a head of the Einsatzkommando 9, Philbert behaved like a very strict leader, the witness said. He was, moreover, one of the most radical and efficient leaders of the killing unit. Under his supervision, the Einsatzkommando 9 started to kill as early as the 4th of July. Then, Lida, Grodno, and especially Vilnius were the theater of mass killing of ever-growing dimension. Philbert was responsible for the annihilation of the Jewish community in Vilnius, till then called the Jerusalem of Lithuania. He had very early the idea to rely upon neighboring units of the Wehrmacht or on local police and militias to compensate the weakness of the manpower of this unit. The tribunal who condemned it to a life sentence held him responsible for the killing of at least 11,000 people. He was a very strict and pushy leader, and many witness accounts describe him pushing his men during the killings. There are no evidence, as for other Einsatzkommando leaders, that he personally killed people. Around the end of July, Philbert held a meeting with his staff officer and told them that they henceforth had to kill women and children, which was done on a daily basis from August 41 and after. November 41, however, he was sent back in Germany. The reason of it remains unclear. At the time he was removed, he had been 2 times the subject of criticism by his superiors. Heydrich had been unsatisfied by his performance at the Department 6 till June 41, and allegedly by Arthur Nebe, head of the Einsatzgruppe B, and by Heydrich for 2 low figures in the execution reports. Was his competence put in question? Philbert would have loved to argue that he had been removed because of his lack of zeal or radicality, but indeed, his commando had been the first in any of the Einsatzgruppen to kill massively children and women. The Einsatzkommando 9 was the second most murderers in the Einsatzgruppe B, and if Philbert had been insufficient under Arthur Nebe's supervision, the latest wouldn't have given him a second chance in recruiting him at the criminal police to struggle against corruption the 4th of July 1944. Philbert was a committed Nazi, a radical leader, and one of the worst mass killers of the Einsatzgruppe B. But fact is that he had been removed because he had a nervous collapse during the Osteinsatz. Philbert and Henry Dix, the psychologist who visited Philbert in jail, mentioned both this cause of removal. Philbert was not the only one to experience psychological difficulties to come to terms with the Osteinsatz and its murderous side. People like Erich von der Bartzelewski, the SS and Polizeiführer in White Russia, stayed in a hospital for nightmares and anguish for months. Let's conclude. Philbert's case teaches us many sides of the perpetrator experience of the genocide. First, the question of the personal interest is always complex. Material interest, greed, can be powerful motivation, but we're barely on the first line in the motivation of the perpetrators. But personal interest is rarely only material. Self-esteem, prestige, symbolic reward, careerism, power also belong to the personal interest that can move people, especially in the SS. But at this point, we must understand that this kind of personal interest is entangled with ideological commitment. You cannot be moved by a system of belief to which you are not strongly dedicated. As the case of Alfred Philbert shed the light on a deeply convinced SS militant whose dedication went as far as genocide. But the case of Philbert also teaches us that one can be radical and convinced, drenched with anti-Semitism and hatred, and collapse. At what point? Because the experience of killing is an ordeal you can't really take. Of course, we have seen that Philbert went through this collapse and recovered, of course. He remained deeply convinced that he was not responsible for what he had done and ordered, but that's another side of the story. Thank you for your attention.